Alright, this is part 2 of our roughages section. We're going to talk specifically a little bit about pastures and rangeland and how they're used in livestock production. We've got a lot of different types of herbage, or that plant material that we can feed to livestock. There's 4 major categories. Those are either going to be grasses, which are a member of a specific family, and there's over 6,000 species of grasses. Or we're going to have legumes, which are of a specific family, with over 14,000 species. Most of our pastures at the university farm are made up of stuff like orchard grass, fescue, which fall into the grass categories, and then we have a lot of clover, specifically white clover at the farm. The other common legume that we do feed is alfalfa hay. That is a very common legume that is fed to livestock. A couple other types of herbage that we have are forbs, broadleaf, non-woody plants. Sometimes we will overseed our pastures with a type of plant called a brassica. Turnips are an example of a brassica. Kale is a brassica. And we sometimes utilize those in livestock production as well. Finally, the last herbage category is the browse. And for this, it's mostly on the rangelands. It's the woody plants, things like sagebrush and different types of brush, mesquite, those types of things that animals can graze. Various animals are adapted to various types of these herbage masses. When we talk about grasses, there are 2 types. My voice is going out on me, so you guys are going to have to bear with me on this video. We have the perennial grasses that are both native and introduced. Perennial meaning they live out their life cycle over time, over several years, as opposed to an annual, such as the annual cereal grains, which we can use for grazing, we can use for hay or silage. The annual crops live out their life cycle in 1 year. Perennial crops will persist over time. And like we mentioned earlier in the previous video, maturity is going to be the largest determinant of forage quality. And so understanding that relationship between forage maturity and forage quality is critical. When we talk about legumes, those legumes are all legumes are characterized by the fact that they have certain organisms in their root system, rhizobia, and their job is to convert nitrogen from the atmosphere and put it in a form the plant can use. And legumes are fantastic at doing this, and by having legumes in our pastures of those types of things, we're actually bringing nitrogen from the atmosphere and putting it back into the soil. And it reduces the need for nitrogen fertilization, and they are very, very handy and very important in grazing situations. The most common species is going to be alfalfa and the clovers that we have out at the farm, but you can use a lot of different legumes in not just grazing, but for hay production and other things. Most of the hay produced in the U.S. is alfalfa or contains alfalfa, like a grassy alfalfa. That's the most predominant hay produced in this country. Again, maturity is the major determinant in quality. And as a general rule of thumb, most legumes are going to be higher quality and have more feeding value than the grasses. That's why, because of their ability to convert nitrogen from the atmosphere and the fact that they also have they're more digestible, they have more protein than the grasses, we try to have a good balance of legumes in our grazing systems. As we talk about grazing systems, because some of the species we're going to be working with down the road, like the beef cattle, sheep, and goats, and even the dairy cattle, they graze in different manners. So as we take a look at this diagram, we just want to consider understanding our animals, our herbivores, and how they graze. So if you'll notice along the bottom, we have a gradient that goes from either grass to browse. Grass meaning green leafy stuff. Browse is the woody plants. And so we have all shades in between. We also have the animal's ability to select, what we call selectivity. Animals that don't select really well, meaning they eat everything in front of them, or the really picky eaters up here on this higher end, the high selectivity animals that are very particular for what they want to eat. And if you take a look at our species that we deal with, let's start with the cow. A cow is going to graze predominantly grass, and a cow really is not a particular eater. They have low selectivity. They will go out and gather that material. As we move into some of our other farm animals, we notice that sheep are a little bit higher on that selectivity. They're a little more particular, and they can actually handle a little bit wider variety of grass moving into browse than cattle can. Goats are intermediate feeders, meaning goats are actually able to go into the browse category. You'll see that they can come up and browse. They can be very selective, and they can be not as selective. Goats have a wide range of adaptability, which is why they're so common in developing countries, because of their ability to adapt to a variety of forages and roughages being fed to them. Finally, we have some of our unselected browsers. My favorite, the giraffe. And if you think about a giraffe, they're designed to graze treetops, aren't they? That's how they're built. They graze everything in front of them, but they are definitely grazing the browse. They're not consuming grass. So it's important to understand how our species fit into this system and how it affects their ability to select, because we expect animals to graze pastures differently. And that's why things like multi-species grazing can come in very handy, because animals are going to pick and choose different parts of the pasture to graze. As we talk about grazing, another key concept besides understanding what what the animals will be selecting for is defining overgrazing and undergrazing. And stocking rate has an important role on that. If we take a look at our stocking rate, and we have an increasing stocking rate going across this bottom axis, and we'll see how that affects our available forage. If we have a low stocking rate, then we are going to see really high gains per animal, but we're going to have not a lot of forage available, and we're actually underutilizing and undergrazing what we really have. However, in contrast, if we have that optimal stocking rate, which is right here in the center, we're going to get decent gains per animal, but we're also going to see an increase in gain per acre, meaning we could probably run more animals and get more total pounds gained over more animals than we would just by having a lower stocking rate. However, if we cross over and start going to where our stocking rate is too high, we're going to see a decrease in this gain per area. We're also going to see the gain per animal drop drastically. This is where we get into overgrazing and can cause damage to our pastures. So as livestock producers, we are wanting to be in this middle optimal range that balances gain per animal and the gain per unit of land area. That's what a good grazing system is going to do. When we take a look at our grazing systems in the U.S., we have a variety throughout the country, and I think it's important for you guys to understand how these grazing systems come into play. I'm a graduate of Chico State, and I never in a million years would have thought I would have been doing work on subtropical forages in Florida when I graduated from Chico State. And so a little bit of background on some of those forages might have been useful for me going in, so that's why I share this with you. You notice we have several different regions. In the eastern U.S., we have a lot of introduced species, meaning pasture land. And there's going to be cool season and warm season depending on basically latitude and longitude of where those are at. In the northern part of the U.S., we're going to see more cool season. We'll see more warm season in the southern U.S. Down around the Gulf Coast, we actually have an introduced subtropical population. Lots of forages like Bahia grass and stargrass and limpo grass that I never had heard of until I moved down to Florida. So that's mostly the eastern U.S. is mostly introduced species. We brought them in from outside of the U.S. When we get into the plains area, I guess, because the Midwest is actually something different. But when we get into the plains region, we have a lot of native cool and warm season grasses that's utilized as rangeland. In that region, through Oklahoma, Nebraska, the Dakotas, up into parts of Montana, Colorado, down all the way through Texas, we have a lot of native prairie land, tall grass and short grass prairie, and so that's useful. You also have the Great Basin and kind of the shrub steppe, this deserty region that's more of a intermountain bunch grass region. Those are native species as well, but a very different type, more of a browse type as opposed to the grass type that we have in the plains. And finally, out where we're at here on the western coast, we do have more introduced species, native. We do have some native land, but also a lot of introduced forages as well. So that's kind of how the U.S. shapes up in general from a standpoint of grazing lands. That wraps up our talk on pasture and rangeland. There's one more section of roughages that'll cover the hay and silage and some of the crop residues.